I'll be the first to admit that my experience with the Silent Hill franchise is quite limited. I've played only a small portion of Silent Hill 2, the Xbox version, and an even smaller portion of Silent Hill 3 on the PlayStation 2. I have played through Silent Hill Shattered Memories on the Wii, but given how that game was largely written off by many as a suboptimal reimagination of the first game and disregarded by even more because of its utilization of motion controls, I wonder if my experience with that game even counts. In any event, this lack of experience does not mean a lack of interest. While I was very much aware of the Silent Hill 2 remake in 2024, I didn't really have the hardware to run it adequately at the time of its release. This year in 2025, I did acquire more than sufficient hardware to run the most demanding modern games at acceptable levels, but when I saw that an actually new Silent Hill game that wasn't a remake was coming out, and it was the first Silent Hill game to take place in Japan, my interest was piqued enough to wait until the release of that game instead. That game, of course, is Silent Hill F. Full disclosure, as of recording this, I've only played through the story one time, so I've only seen one ending, and thus, this is a potentially incomplete read of the game. But based on the game's initial ending, I want to give my thoughts on the game and what it left me thinking about its story and the themes that it carries. At the very least, even if it doesn't carry through the whole of the game and all of its endings, at least it might be pertinent to the initial one. So with all that preamble out of the way, allow me to share my thoughts about the story and themes of Silent Hill F. I've actually written a 5-page unfinished script for this already, and in the moments before going to sleep one night, I realized that my meandering approach to that script was all wrong, and I finally found a more concrete structure for the themes about Silent Hill F I want to discuss. These themes are societal expectations, tradition, and identity. I managed to distill my ideas down to those main points, and I hope by the time I finish this, I will have successfully communicated what these mean clearly and leave as few people confused as possible. But before I get into this, I think it's probably important to set the scene in a basic way first. Silent Hill F takes place in the city of Ebisugaoka. Ebisugaoka is a dying city in Japan that once flourished after the opening of a mine that then closed sometime before the events depicted in the game. The story also takes place in the 1960s, a time of real growing pains for the country. Like most other countries in the world, Japan faced social upheaval among the youth of the country, and it manifested most prominently as the student movement. This movement was spearheaded by student organizations at universities across the country which sought to overturn the preeminent ruling order of Japan and undo the changes made in the wake of the American occupation of the country after World War II. The stereotype of the quiet, orderly Japanese person with a strong sense of civic responsibility makes it hard to believe, but in many cases this protest movement was more violent than what you saw in America at the time, with the hippie movement and the civil rights protests happening concurrently. These student movements of the 1960s would be prevalent through the decade, but would decrease in number and intensity drastically over the course of the following decades before ultimately reducing to almost nothing. 1969 would see the peak of this activity as schools would be barricaded by students and police would eventually be sent in to break them down and disperse the crowds. The opening stages of the Free Palestine movement at universities across the United States, especially what was seen at NYU, was very reminiscent of those student movement protest days back in Japan in 1969 for many Japanese who were there to experience it, just for reference. So, Silent Hill F takes place during this time of youth movements, social unrest, and a questioning of society, its values, and whether those values are right for or still have any place in modern Japanese society. Now let's look at the general background for our main character, Hinako. Hinako, as we know, at least is a high school girl who grew up in a family of 4, including herself, her mother, father, and older sister. Her older sister, Junko, is considered the perfect daughter by all counts. Or at least she serves as a role model for Hinako to follow. She did well in school, she treated her parents with the proper deference, she had appropriate social behavior as expected of a young Japanese lady, and she went along with the marriage arranged for her by her parents and moved away to live with her husband and his family. Hinako's father is a well-respected member of his community who fell on hard times when his restaurant business venture failed, locking himself away with his thoughts in his house to sulk at the failure and the painful amount of debt that he had accrued attempting to launch the venture have aggravated him, and mixed with his alcoholism has caused him to go into violent fits, during which he would take it out on both Hinako and her mother. There isn't really much about Hinako's mother, and that is not an accident. Hinako's mother is a wife, and that's where the description really ends. She accepts the violent rage of her husband and even excuses it when that violence is directed towards her. She defends her husband because, as his wife, that is her duty. Because of this relationship dynamic, Hinako's relationship and attitude towards both her parents is quite sour. Also noteworthy is Hinako's small circle of friends, Shu, Sakuko, and Rinko. Hinako is closest to Shu, with whom she grew up playing a make-believe game called Space War, where they would fight alien invaders attacking the Earth. As for Sakuko and Rinko, for the sake of this discussion, I will give further information as it deems relevant, but suffice it to say for now that both Sakuko and Rinko have their own neuroses that affect the quality of their relationship with Hinako. Now that we've set the stage and we have our players, let's dive into what I believe are the major themes of Silent Hill F's story. If you're a foreigner living in Japan and seeking a permanent residence visa, what immigration will take special note of is your track record as a foreign resident in their country regarding maintaining an acceptable standard of legal and social responsibility. Social responsibility is a paramount virtue in Japanese society and is one of the aspects of its society that it is internationally notable for. It isn't so simple, though. Generally, the pressures for how to behave and how to navigate the social climate and conform to the social norms of Japanese society don't start being applied immediately. Usually, children are traditionally allowed to express themselves in whichever ways they like, given that their actions don't prove to be a significant danger to themselves or others. There's an understanding that kids can't really make the connection between their behavior and how it affects others, and thus are allowed to basically get it out of their system and give them time to develop the cognitive ability to notice the world and autonomy of people outside of themselves. As kids get older and enter adolescence, the pressure of society begins to increase, but the way Japanese society applies pressure to people to conform in certain ways manifests itself in different ways than how it might sound. Japanese society takes heavy influence from Chinese aristocratic society, and so a lot of the isms of Japanese societal norms have seen appropriation from classical Chinese customs. As living conditions for Japan's broader population improved with industrialization and the spread of metropolitan lifestyles spread more to the masses, the rules of aristocratic societies began to trickle down to the more common masses. Once you get to the 1960s, the time frame during which the events of Silent Hill F's story takes place, despite the social movements taking place at the time, the old expectations for certain groups of certain people of certain ages remain strongly embedded in society. Hinako is a girl, and so it's important that she maintains a correct relationship with boys and girls her age. It is notably peculiar to others in this story that Hinako gets along better with boys than girls, and that she spends a large amount of her time playing with Shu. This is considered strange and maybe for some, particularly older women, a potentially serious problem. As Hinako grows up, she is told with increasing frequency by people in her life that she ought to act more like a girl than how she is. We even see that in one of the earlier cutscenes when Rinko makes a comment about how Shu doesn't treat Hinako like a girl and talks to her like she's one of the boys instead. It might not sound like much, but at least in Japan, it carries pretty serious social implications for Hinako, and these kinds of observations are meant to be others' way of pointing out things Hinako should change about herself. Japan is like that. People don't just come out and say that you have to change this or that about yourself. Instead, it will manifest itself as a question veiled with a sense of curiosity, or just a passing observation about something. In many cases, this type of criticism usually leads the person to feel ashamed and subsequently prompts them to change that thing about themselves or whatever else. It is highly effective because of its lack of feeling and coolness that makes the shame of it more potent. The expectation for a typical girl in Japanese society is clearly illustrated in the way Junko has led her life up to this point. And one of those primary points in a girl's life in this sense is her eventual marriage. Hinako has it constantly pushed onto her, the idea that a girl's marriage is the most important part of her life, and that a girl derives basically all of her value, at least as an adult, from that relationship. This is back during a time when marriages were still largely arranged, and given what we know about the game's initial ending, we can interpret these scenes where the virtues of marriage are instilled into her as evidence for Hinako's doubt about this system. Alas, this is what she must do. It's part of her filial duty to her parents that she must go through with this marriage, much like her sister before her, and go through all the things that a marriage relationship implies, including moving away from her hometown and her parents to start a new life with her husband and his parents and the eventual raising of children. The horror of Silent Hill F in this sense, I believe, comes from Hinako's own perception of these expectations society has for her. It creates a conflict within her, and her perception of everything becomes warped as a result of catastrophic thinking. She sees the relationship between her parents and can only wonder if she might have to bear the same kind of violence her mother had to. She knows that her parents mean the best for her, but given her resentment for her parents for constantly comparing her to her sister and wishing for her to act more like a girl, and the fact that once she leaves the house she grew up in after her marriage, she cannot ever return. The doubt of the wisdom of this decision to go through with this marriage at the wishes of her parents become increasingly unbearable for her, manifesting itself as psychosomatic illnesses that can only be kept at bay by medication. If I'm going to play armchair psychologist here, I think her space war game she would play with Shu morphed into her way of perhaps dissociating from true reality into a world of imagined monsters, and perhaps the medication that she is now taking in very high dosages, as reported by the doctor's notes you can find scattered around the world throughout the game, has brought on a form of severe psychosis. The force of society's expectations for Hinako are like that of the rising tide. They are inevitable, and it's that impotence that Hinako has against this force that at least partially pushes her to her breaking point. It's always interesting to see how other people read games like this one. Particularly, I've seen people of a certain political leaning who read this game story seeing Hinako as an antagonist, someone who is a psychotic pill-popping murderer who rejects traditional values, to paraphrase. That's an interesting read, I suppose, but I can't help but to get the sense that this is definitely the kind of read by a type of person who can only see things through an especially modern American political lens. But if there is one thing I can strongly agree with in this read is that there is definitely a strong emphasis on tradition in Silent Hill F. If you are from the United States, it can be difficult to relate to or understand how strongly other countries around the world have historically identified with their own traditions and heritages. For Americans, race is almost exclusively defined by skin color, and a lot of the time leads to a misunderstanding of foreign attitudes and cultures as they relate to each other, usually defaulting to monolithic understandings of large groups of societies of people, which can, in many cases, vary drastically from one another. But this is a mere symptom of the fact that the United States is an inherently multicultural society, as the country has been settled by groups of people who come from very different societies, even during the colonial era. While its government and society is largely organized around the philosophies brought about by the Enlightenment, and its rule of law continues to form that as the core basis of its general and philosophical and cultural underpinnings which unite the states under one federated republic, language and culture can still have fairly large variations depending on your location in the country, and what drives those differences are the residual cultures and customs of the people who originally settled there. So it might be strange for some to see racism of Japanese against Filipinos, for example, since for the average American, they're all Asian. The same can be said for the various Arab uprisings against their Turkish overlords over a century ago, despite the fact that, at least from a modern American layman's standpoint, the two appear on paper to be largely indistinct. That is a gross oversimplification of history, but suffice it to say that ethnocultural identity is of paramount importance to large swaths of societies around the world, and arguably one of the societies which holds its traditions very close, and in some ways in its past that its people would rather forget about, is Japan. Japan is a very interesting society. It has a very strong sense of tradition, but being one of the largest societies in the Sinosphere, it also takes heavy influence in nearly every sector of its society from China. But it isn't China, and if you have any knowledge of Japan, you could never mistake Japanese culture as Chinese culture. Japanese tradition is very old, certainly older than most countries we know today. On top of that, Japan holds true to a lot of these old traditions, though not necessarily all of them. Some very old traditions slowly die off as different ways of doing things or different means of expression are developed and see widespread adoption. But as with the evolution of all traditions, they all have in their different iterations with the progress of time roots to the original in some way or form. I think it should probably be pretty clear to most people that despite the evolution of traditions over the centuries of its recorded history, that Japan's traditions aren't just traditions, but they carry strong ties to Japanese people's sense of collective national identity. Unlike post-Mao China, which lived through the Cultural Revolution, which sought to essentially delete the aspects of old Chinese culture Mao felt were outdated in an effort to modernize, Japanese modernization attempted to seek a middle ground depending on the demands that modernization required. That being said, many things weren't just thrown away or deleted, but instead were recontextualized for a new age. There was still pushback, of course, but generally speaking, there were ways to preserve something resembling Japan's core essence, and because of this strong dedication to its culture and heritage, Japan still maintains many ancient customs which, even if modern people don't necessarily have any strong overt connection to it, the iconography or legends still have some innate meaning to them and, in some cases, are even equally powerful in the feelings they evoke. Of course, there was a time when tradition was used to spur less than civil attitudes towards certain other neighboring countries, especially in the first half of the 20th century. But I think most people can agree that part of what makes Japan such an aesthetically inviting place to visit is its strong commitment to maintaining its tradition. After all, what is a country without the maintenance and culture it was originally built on? But what is tradition? Aside from the shrines and their related festivals and rituals, classical Japanese literature, art, and music, where exactly does tradition begin? For example, Buddhism was a cultural import to Japan via Korea, which itself had it imported from China, which itself had it imported from the Indian subcontinent where it originated. Are Japan's Buddhist schools traditional Japanese culture? Some might say that the Japanification of Buddhism might make it a Japanese tradition, but it is a lot newer than Japanese society itself. Whichever the case may be, the fact remains that understanding the relationship of cultural tradition and time is important because while many things remain the same at their core as far as the sentiment is concerned, rituals, practices, and beliefs do all change with the coming and going of generations and with the way collectives of people shift in their thinking. A long-standing tradition of Japanese society that still somewhat exists today, though not at all as common practice, is the process of matchmaking and arranged marriages. This was still a pretty common practice even up until surprisingly recently, and even now, matchmaking services can still be enlisted for people to find a marriage partner. But this was an even more prominent and mandatory practice for countless many in the last century. Romance as a prerequisite for marriage is a modern concept, even outside of Japan, but it is even newer in Japan. Before this, matchmaking was done by the parents, and sometimes going through a professional matchmaker who would do in-depth research, almost like a private investigator, into the lives of prospective matches, their family history of illness, and their reputation in society to see if that other person could make a good match for their clients. This was a process that sometimes began when the child was still a child, and the decision would be made long before they reached adulthood. The process was, of course, a lot pickier with aristocratic families, since they especially needed to be careful about who in their family married into whose family and vice versa. But even for middle-class families who participated in this process, it could still be a pretty lengthy process, especially if you had a daughter who behaved not quite like one. From the viewpoint of someone who values this particular tradition, I can see how they would be frustrated with Hinako's social disposition. Someone like Hinako might be difficult to find a match for because, generally speaking, if she's a girl who usually prefers to hang around with boys and interacts with them in an equal way as opposed to with the awareness of her social stance relative to them, many prospective bachelors might reject such a match. In this way, Hinako's mother's words of the value of a girl being tied to receiving the love of a man in marriage might be words of comfort to Hinako in times of doubt expressed by Hinako to her mother. To those in her life, this handing off of Hinako to her marriage with the man personified in Hinako's mind as the fox mask is as normal and natural a process as graduation from school. It's a tradition that has perpetuated itself through the generations, and there is really no conceivable reason by those around Hinako that there would be any problem. And you know what? I think Hinako understands this position too. Here's the thing about the claim that Hinako is rejecting traditional values. She isn't. Through the length of the game, there are countless hokora that Hinako goes to pray, and where she goes to collect talismans, which are meant to bring her good luck in certain aspects of her life. These are deeply traditional aspects of Japanese culture, and the way she can simply go to one to seek strength, I think, says a lot about her belief in her country's own indigenous religion. There is also a very interesting juxtaposition between two different worlds. The fog world, which is the true-to-life depiction of Ebisu Gaoka, and the dark shrine world, which is a more abstract world that takes the form of a very large Shinto shrine. I think we are meant to believe that the real world is the fog world and the dark shrine world is some kind of imaginary world. But the ending makes it clear that the metaphorical world is actually the fog world and the real world is the dark shrine world, but seen through the eyes of someone who has seemingly lost their grasp of their perception of the real world. The whole dark shrine world sequence of events doesn't show Hinako rejecting traditional values. In fact, she acquiesces to them. Even further, the pills she's taking are meant to help keep her in the state of mind of acceptance to the arranged marriage. There is a part of her that wants to go through with this, as it is her filial duty as a daughter to do so. I don't think she would be trying so hard to comply with the terms of this tradition if she really didn't want to. The societal pressures exist, which is probably why she works so hard to keep her contrary feelings in check. But if it was the case that she really didn't want to get married, she certainly had the option to sabotage the matchmaking process. If you've read Sasame Yuki or the Makioka sisters in English, you probably understand exactly what I mean when I mention the struggle that is the matchmaking process with Makioka Yukiko. Hinako writes in her journal that the fox mask who represents her planned future husband is not a bad person. She seems to like him well enough. She doesn't know him well, but she likes being around him and she likes the way he makes her feel when he leads her through the trials of the Dark Shrine world. She isn't inadvertently opposed to joining him, and I think her willingness to go through the process of her transformation is evidence of the fact that she does not reject traditional values, at least not entirely. After all, it's not just a tradition of her parents, but it is also part of what makes up her national identity. This was the word which ultimately prompted me to begin writing this script. I was trying to sleep on Monday night, and just before sleep had a chance to take me, the word identity came to me, and I had my little eureka moment. Suddenly, I could make sense of my meandering thoughts about Silent Hill F, thanks to this anchor. Tradition and its relationship to society at large is tied to identity, a sense of national identity. That should probably be self-evident at this point. If you were to ask a Japanese person on the street if the traditions they've known and grown up with were deleted, if Japan would still feel like Japan, they probably would say no. Especially in recent years, this can be seen in Japan's escalating economic and population issues, recent Japanese political movements, and the shifts in attitudes towards foreigners in Japan. Even if some traditions fall out of favor, they are almost always replaced by something new that, while maybe not in the global scheme of things, at least to Japanese people, feel Japanese. But we've talked enough about the collective of society, but how does Hinako relate to this personally? Hinako was an odd child, spending a lot of her time either with the boys or on her own. She doesn't hate girls, since she does make friends with Rinko and Sakuko, but her closest friend is Shu, with whom she spent so much of her childhood playing games of make-believe like Space War. While other girls eventually grew out of these things as they got older, Hinako continued the way she always did, and finds herself increasingly questioning why boys and girls begin segregating themselves as they got older, when there was previously no problem with things like playing or even bathing together in the past. She does mention a preference for hanging around with boys in her journal, but she really doesn't hate girls. The issue stems more from the fact that the girls she has tried to associate with in the past have rejected her because she gets along so well with boys. I think Hinako's questioning of this barrier is mistaken by some as an attempt by Hinako to try to deconstruct some aspect of Japanese society, but I don't really get that sense. When it comes to the question of why Hinako might be losing her grip on reality and herself, I think it really boils down to her conflicting feelings about what she's expected to do and who she really is. One of the hardest yet most important parts of psychological development for people is establishing for themselves their own sense of identity. It isn't always an easy process, and many people go through their lives not really establishing a deeper sense of self, while some never really establish one at all. A personal sense of self is important because that serves as a vehicle for people to be able to judge what they want out of life and what makes them happy. On average, most people want mostly the same basic things from life, and this, I believe anyway, is established both through individual personality and culture. But sometimes you get people who deviate from the conventional wants and wishes of other people in society at large, and that's where you get characters like Hinako. The fact of the matter is that this kind of story is not a new one, at least not in Asian fiction. For me, Silent Hill F's story is strongly evocative of the 18th century Chinese novel The Dream of the Red Chamber, or The Story of the Stone, depending on the English translation you choose. It is one of the 5 Chinese classics, and was deemed so good by Mao Zedong himself that it was one of the very select few classical Chinese pieces of literature to survive the Cultural Revolution. This 5-volume-long novel tells the story of the Jia family's slow decline in the Chinese aristocracy during the Qing dynasty, and how the family's heir, Jia Baoyu, is the only hope for the survival of the family remaining in the upper echelons of the imperial aristocracy. Baoyu has very little interest in his studies and the civil service exams, and instead prefers to spend his time writing frivolous poetry with the girls. He states on many occasions that he prefers girls to boys, and likes spending time with them doing things that aren't traditionally considered masculine. Eventually, as he gets older, he becomes more disillusioned with the world and the state of human existence, and instead of going to take the exams to become an imperial government official, he instead becomes a Buddhist monk, abandoning his family and the world itself to return to one of the Pure Land realms in his enlightenment. Over the course of the novel, things he sees as beautiful slowly begin to die off and be replaced with things that serve a more pragmatic purpose as the fortunes of his family continue to sour. What pushes him over the edge for good are the results of his family's decision on who he will be married to. The novel depicts something of a love triangle where Jia Baoyu is between Lin Daiyu and Jia Baochai. It's clear he finds both girls attractive, but his affections are far and away strongest for Lin Daiyu. It's to a point where it seems almost like a decision that makes itself, because the two are so close, and both were born under equally, somewhat spiritually miraculous circumstances. And for the reader, it also makes sense why their match makes sense. They both share compatible idiosyncrasies, although Lin Daiyu seems to be the more capable of the two as far as their composition skill goes. However, Lin Daiyu is sickly. She's constantly suffering from mysterious chronic illnesses that continually flare up at the smallest change, and she is constantly taking medicine to help her with those ailments. She's thin, frail, and the Dowager Lady Jia is concerned about her longevity and fitness for continuing the family line. Jia Baochai is different, almost the opposite. She is described as being healthier and possessing a much stouter constitution than Daiyu. Not only is she stronger, but she has also cultivated many of the skills necessary to take on the responsibility of a proper wife to the heir of an aristocratic family like the Jia family. She has a strong command of the kind of decorum it requires, and she also has the pragmatic sense a proper Chinese wife should have to make important decisions. On top of that, Baoyu, despite his affections for Daiyu clearly being stronger, still is fond of Baochai and gets along with her just fine, and has so since childhood. When it is decided that Baoyu is to marry Baochai, Daiyu's illness flares up again and takes to what will become her deathbed. The day Baoyu and Baochai are officially married, Daiyu dies, and Baoyu, in his grief, after seeing ghosts of people he knew who were long since passed, decides to run away and become a Buddhist monk to the dismay of his family. I point all of this out as a way to emphasize the fact that Silent Hill F is basically telling a version of this kind of story. There are many parallels between Hinako and Baoyu, especially when it comes to their reactions to their arranged marriages and their relationships with the opposite gender. Each character has a strong personality that exists at least somewhat outside of the typical conventional personality one would expect of someone of their respective disposition, especially when it comes to their gender. They don't behave the way they should, and it causes worry for members of the family, even when they are still young. Both experience feelings of love for characters who seem like a good match for them but aren't quite right for marriage for whatever reason. It's clear for Bao Yu, but for Hinako, that's still kind of a blind spot. And while the concerns about matching Bao Yu with his future wife and Hinako with her future husband come from fundamentally different places, one thing that makes their situations so similar is the fact that despite their strong sense of personality and the agency that they've exercised in their lives up to this point, they have almost no, if any, influence over the matchmaking process. It goes ahead, and seemingly the decision made will leave them both feeling less happy than they think they would otherwise. As a result, they both start to lose their grip on reality. One runs away and the other goes on a murderous rampage. I need to emphasize the fact here that as much as I know based on the information provided in Hinako's various journal entries, Hinako does not hate who she is being married to. It's not even anything to do with the marriage itself, but I think it comes from a place of doubt born from a strong desire for self-determination. Again, she isn't flatly rejecting her expected role to play in society insofar as becoming a wife. But I think what is causing the conflict inside her is the fact that not only does she feel, and in some cases is practically powerless to influence this matchmaking process, but that based on what she's seen with her father, the way he has treated both herself and her mother, if that's something she really wants to bear. Is that something she can handle or accept? What if she doesn't want that for herself? This guy seems nice to her now, but what if he turns on her at some point? How about the boy she got along with so well during her school days? She has these thoughts and they cause her great distress, so she starts taking medication to escape them. She doesn't want these thoughts, but stifling them also makes her feel as though she is killing what is potentially her true self. She goes through the transformation rituals to saw off her own arm, to be branded, and to have her face replaced by something else before finally being consumed by flowers, which supposedly is a flower that symbolizes death in Japan, which collectively seem to symbolize an erasure of her sense of self and potentially her true self. Because of all of these feelings being bottled up over time and being suppressed by the increased dosages of these red capsules, I think it's clear that the horrors experienced in this game are the result of an internal struggle of someone who understands her role in society, isn't sure about who she is and how she fits into it, feels totally powerless to stop a process she might not be ready for, and is finally at a breaking point where she becomes totally delusional and in her psychosis kills those who she feels led her down this path of suffering, thinking they were apparitions they aren't in reality. A real psychotic break. This isn't a strong, independent woman taking back her power and eschewing traditions in her empowerment. She is instead in a dire state of panic and psychosis. Often, people in our lives want the best for us, and more often than not, the advice and the things they do to help us are done with only our best interests at heart. Unfortunately, if you are someone who exists somewhere outside the conventional or what is considered normal, you might want different kinds of things, and sometimes the things that other people want are things you couldn't imagine ever wanting for yourself. It can sometimes feel as though these people are forcing their ideal life onto you, and it can come off as malicious. In reality, though, the truth is that most people can't see outside of themselves. They only know what they want and end up acting on a misplaced sense of empathy to help others attain not necessarily what that other person wants, but what they think they would want for themselves if they were in that other person's position. I'm sure Hinako's mother worked tirelessly to find a suitor for Hinako, and I can imagine the panic she must have felt for her daughter. For her mother, Hinako is not like her sister. She has certain idiosyncrasies that already make her reputation among the pool of potential suitors questionable, and I'm sure a lot of them rejected her offers. I can imagine her feeling of need to rush to find a suitor for Hinako because one of the only few things Hinako has that can help her is her youth, and as it goes, in these matchmaking scenarios, the older the bride gets with no match, the less valuable she will be to an increasing number of potential suitors. There is an 8-page poem written about what happens to these kinds of girls in the Chinese play, The Peony Pavilion, that goes into excruciating detail about those women who age out of matchmaking, and it is unflattering, to put it mildly. She's not rushing to get rid of Hinako. She just wants what she thinks is best for her daughter were she in her shoes. After all, that's likely what her mother did for her, and if she failed to do so for her own daughter, then perhaps she would feel like a failure of a mother herself. Unfortunately, she ends up being catastrophically out of step with Hinako. Hinako doesn't know who she is well enough to know what she wants. She's never asked by anyone, nor does she ever ask herself. Instead, she suppresses it. I think she's okay with the marriage, but I don't think she's okay with the fact that she's not sure enough that she's okay with it. As convoluted as that sounds, when it feels that someone is being robbed of their own agency, even if what they are doing is totally fine, the fact that it wasn't a decision they had a hand in making, despite the fact that it directly affected them, would make anyone uneasy, at least. Silent Hill F tells the failed coming-of-age story of a girl who never had that crucial moment of self-discovery that is so important in the psychological development of people. She runs from it, she fights it, she suppresses it, she attempts to kill it, but feels that every effort she makes, she loses a part of herself she can never get back. It is a conflict with tradition and societal expectation, not necessarily in protest, but in a questioning of what she really wants in life. She's stuck in high school, and she defers to those memories and memories of a past she can't go back to. Tragically, she ends up going on a killing spree, at least in the first ending, and she finally pushes beyond her breaking point and can't seem to see reality clearly anymore. Her inner self breaks through the noise of the pills and the words of assurance, the forces of tradition and expectation, and is possessed by the memories of a traumatic past and a warped sense of reality, powered by the same imagination used to play her game of pretend space war with Shu. She only sees perverted versions of things representing different elements of conventional femininity and sexuality, and her response is to kill it. So she does. Maybe this video is a gross over-intellectualization of Silent Hill F, but after finishing the game, I couldn't help but to explore what all of it might mean. I've read my fair share of various genres of Chinese and Japanese literature, and this game's story really felt strongly like one of those in video game form. I didn't want to stop playing if for no other reason than to find the answers for what is actually happening. Silent Hill seems to have a tradition of playing with players' expectations and making the audience question what is real and while yes, I'm sure there is room for a more literal interpretation of the events of games in the series, I like the way Silent Hill F at least left me thinking about what it is actually saying about this character. Japanese society and its traditions have changed quite a bit since the events of this game, and it's really interesting to see this conflict of the self versus tradition come up in a psychological horror setting. Japan has often struggled with balancing global cultural trends and its own tradition, and the fear of having the identity brought to Japan by holding true to those traditions being supplanted by potentially more influential foreign cultures. You saw this with the persecution of Christians, the pushback against the Meiji reforms, the 1920s youth movements, the 1960s youth movements, and even today with the demographic issues Japan faces, and the feared implications that could carry if the reliance on immigration to fill the gaps left behind by an aging population as it pertains to the preservation of Japanese society. I'm not saying that they're all right or all wrong, but this is an issue that Japan has grappled with since its inception, practically. And that's what makes this game so interesting, because its story is unmistakably Japanese in this way. I'm rambling at this point, but I think I've made my point pretty clear, or at least I hope I did. Let me know what you thought about Silent Hill F's story. Was your takeaway totally different? I'm always interested in hearing what other people think about these things, so feel free to write what you thought about it in the comments below. Until next time, keep retromaxing.